In London is Matthew Saltmarsh, a senior communications officer for the UN High Commission for Refugees. He covers the Middle East, including Syria. And still with us is the Syrian activist Asaad Hanna in Gaziantep in Turkey. Matthew Saltmarsh, is it even possible to sum up the humanitarian cost of 7 years of war in Syria?
Good afternoon. Well, this really is the humanitarian crisis of our time. I mean, if we assume that there were around 22 million people in Syria before the conflict, now well over half of those people have been displaced either internally or abroad as refugees, 60%. And if we compare that to a country like Turkey, you're talking about the equivalent of maybe 48 million people, or in the UK, 40 million people. So it's a huge humanitarian and displacement crisis. 7 years on, the needs of those who are displaced within Syria, but also the refugees in the immediate neighborhood and those who have gone further afield, are extremely acute. The amount of aid that's being provided is just not enough to provide for those people, just the basics. We know that the numbers living in poverty and in extreme poverty have been rising year on year in recent years. And it's not that the international community has ignored Syria. Back in 2015, in particular, there was a big groundswell of support and a lot of money was raised for Syrian refugees and the Syrian crisis. But it's simply the scale of the problem is absolutely overwhelming, and the people who are suffering, the Syrian refugees and the internally displaced, simply do not have enough support to meet their needs.
And yet there does seem to be a certain reluctance in the international community. You will know well yourself, talking to us from London, the anti-migrant feeling that has been growing around Western Europe and the reluctance of so many of those countries in that area to take in Syrian refugees. And then your own agency, quoting figures from January this year of how many people are living in extreme poverty just in the refugee camps in Lebanon, that 58% live on less than $2.87 per person per day, that 76% live on less than $3.84 per person per day. Money itself will go somewhere towards helping these people, but the international community isn't doing enough. You as a UN representative may not be able to point the finger, but other people who talk about these issues in their living rooms, they do point the finger.
Well, the international community did reach out several years ago. Let's not forget that back in 2014, 15 and into 2016, there was huge movement of Syrians into Europe, and over 1 million Syrians have claimed or are claiming asylum in Europe at the moment. And of course, 5.5 million Syrians find themselves in neighboring countries, particularly Turkey, which has the largest number, but also Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt and Iraq. And we do have resettlement programs. We at the UNHCR have been asking the international community to try to do more to increase those numbers of resettled Syrians. But of course, the numbers are small, and it is really a drop in the ocean. So that then leaves financial support, and there's a conference coming up in Brussels, and we've had annual conferences before in London and in the Middle East and in Europe as well. And again, we, the international humanitarian community, will be seeking more funds, somewhere around $8 billion this year for inside Syria, but also the region. But we know we won't get that. If we look at last year for the refugee response, it was about 50% funded, just over 50%. And what that means in reality is that programs cannot be completed, cash assistance has to be reduced, and inevitably vulnerability tends to rise as a result. So the international community is aware and it is doing something, but of course we would urge it to do more. And above all, of course, the most important thing is for the international community to persuade the actors on the ground to get around the table and to try and come up with a viable peace process, because everything really flows from that. Once that falls into place, the returns and the reconstruction of the country can begin in earnest. But until that happens, there will be no reconstruction.
Asaad Hanna, one of the most brutal examples of the desperation of people in Syria came in 2013, when religious leaders issued fatwas allowing citizens to eat cats and dogs because otherwise they would die. When you've been on the ground in Syria, what do you see?
Actually, what we saw was a horrific situation. As you mentioned, that happened in many areas. The people started to die because of starving, because of the government, the Syrian government, were denying was besieging the areas in Homs city, which is my city, in Ghouta, Eastern Aleppo before, and Zabadani, Madaya, all the areas. But let's don't talk about what the government did, because it's obvious it was a war crime. Let's talk about what the international community did for those people. Who is the international community? The international community, it's the United Nations. What did they do? They didn't do anything for those people. They helped. They helped the civilians to go from their homes to another area. So they gave them camps instead of their homes. Zabadani, I will just give names for some areas which was evacuated before. Zabadani, Madaya, Homs, now it's Ghouta, countryside of Damascus, Eastern Aleppo. Eastern Aleppo, it has before about 400,000 civilians, or it was about let's say 250,000, the exact number. 250,000 of civilians were under the attacks and the shelling, the missiles, the chemical attacks, and the international community did nothing. And then the United Nations and the international community helped them to move from Aleppo to Idlib. Why? To be killed in Idlib. I know many of the people who went out of Aleppo and went to Idlib, and then they died because of the attacks there. And another thing about what happened to the people during these 7 years, if we are talking about 7 years. So, according to what the guest said, a lot of money raised for those refugees. I will mention something for the refugees who went to Europe in 2013 and 14. The huge amount of people. They went by sea. They faced the death. They crossed the sea to go to Europe. They didn't go by the United Nations. They didn't help anyone or they helped very few people. But one of my friends, when I came to Turkey early in 2014, he told me that he got the acceptance, and the United Nations told him that one of the countries accepted him to go there. And right now we are in 2018, and he's still waiting here to go there. So. Okay. It's just wasting time. Let me just mention this also. After the people went out of Eastern Aleppo, which was destroyed by Assad regime, the United Nations just 2 months ago, they started to give trucks and vehicles to the Assad government to fix and to make a reconstruction in Eastern Aleppo. So they start to make the reconstruction with the Assad government, which killed about 1 million of civilians.
Matthew Saltmarsh and Asaad Hanna, thank you both very much for being on the Newsmakers.